Hello everyone, welcome to History 101. This is Professor Hasselman, and in this part of the course you're going to be working on a group presentation and a group project dealing with the writing of our U.S. Constitution. Now most of us are familiar with the opening to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted by men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, so wrote Thomas Jefferson in his Declaration of Independence, the renowned document penned and published in 1776 that officially proclaimed the independence of the colonies from Great Britain. Now, these time-honored words reflect much about the colonists' continuing struggle with King George III and Parliament. And in the eyes of Jefferson and many others, the British government had failed to guarantee the colonists the rights they deserved. In declaring independence, Jefferson and his compatriots set out to free the colonies from oppressive overseas ruling, and established governments that fulfilled the desires of the people that guaranteed them necessary rights. Now, to that end, Jefferson proceeded to insist in the Declaration that each colony have the power to establish an independent government, as free and independent states, as he called it. And the former colonies, as he wrote, have full power to do all acts and things which independent states may of right do. Now, having overthrown one government, the new nation immediately began creating 14 new governments. As each colony assumed statehood, it appointed committees to draw up a state constitution in order to define and establish the duties, powers, and organization of the government. Now, in the meantime, Congress appointed a committee to write a national constitution that would govern all these, quote, free and independent states. Now, the Articles of Confederation allowed for a different relationship between state governments and the national government than it does today, and you'll be reading more about this later. The powers granted Congress were severely limited. It had the power to coin money, make treaties, raise armies, and wage war, but it lacked the authority to collect taxes, impose tariffs, suppress rebellions, draft soldiers, or to regulate trade between the states and with foreign countries. Now, the states had many of the powers the Articles had denied them, coining money, taxing imports, even from other states, raising armies, and enforcing treaties. Congress's reliance on states for law enforcement made the central government weak and the state government strong. Now, if Congress lacked money, for instance, it would ask the states for the necessary funds, and the states could decide whether to supply the national government with the money it needed. Now, as time wore on, the government created by the Articles of Confederation proved less and less effective. In 1786, as you'll read about more, a rebellion led by Daniel Shays of Massachusetts demonstrated the weaknesses of the Confederation. Farmers who had suffered monetary losses in the years following the Revolution wanted their debts canceled and demanded that the state legislature print paper money. Now, the legislature refused. The rebels attacked the federal arsenal in Springfield. The rebellion was suppressed only after the Boston merchants raised enough money to put together an army to oppose Shays. Now, many American leaders looked to the incident in Massachusetts as proof that America needed a stronger central government, a government that can put down rebellions, solve financial problems, and resist the demand for paper money. Now, having witnessed the U.S. government's problems in winning the Revolution, collecting taxes, regulating trade, and conducting foreign policy, other colonists shared this lack of confidence in the government of the Confederation, and they called for a new constitution to remedy the problem that plagued the nation. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and George Washington led the movement for a new constitution. In February of 1787, Congress called for a convention to meet in Philadelphia in order to revise the Articles of Confederation. Ignoring their limited instructions, 55 delegates representing 12 different states decided that the U.S. needed a completely different plan of government. They scrapped the Articles and proceeded to take on the daunting task of writing what became the Constitution that has governed this nation since its ratification in 1788. Now, there were several issues before the convention, and the men who gathered at the convention considered an endless number as they pieced together the new Constitution. 5 of the major problems they faced included representation by state or by population, local control, states' rights versus national authority, democracy versus checks and balances, the Bill of Rights, and slavery and the slave trade. Now, in terms of representation by state or by population, large and populous states, including Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Virginia, wanted each state to have votes in Congress in proportion to their population. Thus, Virginia, with 820,000 inhabitants, would have 16 votes, while Delaware, with 59,000 people, would have but 1 vote. Sparsely populated states such as Delaware, New Jersey, and Georgia insisted that each state have 1 vote, as they had under the Articles. And some of the middle-sized states, like Connecticut, were prepared to offer a compromise: a House of Representatives based on population, and a Senate based upon equal rights for all states. Now, local control versus national authority, or states' rights versus federal rights. All the delegates wanted to give the national government more power than it had under the Articles of Confederation. But the question remained, how much more? Extremists like Alexander Hamilton of New York and Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania wanted to abolish state governments completely. States' rights advocates such as John Lansing of New York and Luther Martin of Maryland, on the other hand, felt that, quote, the general government was meant merely to support the state governments. The convention worked hard to find a solution somewhere between those opposing positions and had a difficult time arriving at an acceptable solution. Now, democracy versus checks and balances. Some of the founding fathers, including Morris and John Dickinson of Delaware, had little faith in the general public who, they felt, quote, can be little trusted with the public interest. They wished to limit the common people's power in the government and suggested some ways of accomplishing this. First, by restricting the right to vote to white males with property. Second, by not allowing the voters to elect the president, senators, or judges. And third, guaranteeing the chief executive immunity from impeachment. Now, the Democratic faction, headed by James Wilson and Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Hugh Williamson of North Carolina, and Luther Martin of Maryland, tended to favor short terms for elected officials, universal manhood suffrage, direct elections of senators and the president, and giving Congress power to impeach the chief executive. Now, most delegates stood somewhere in between these extremes, and they took it upon themselves to engineer a series of compromises on the issue. Now, in terms of the Bill of Rights, several delegates, including Martin, Eldridge Gerry of Massachusetts, and George Mason of Virginia, wanted a Bill of Rights that would limit the powers of the government by protecting the rights of the people. Others, such as Hamilton, Wilson, and Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts, opposed such a bill. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina had concrete suggestions for a bill protecting certain rights, and the convention had to decide whether it wanted or needed a Bill of Rights, and what rights should be protected. Now, in terms of slavery and the slave trade, the question of slavery, and in particular the slave trade, stood out as one of the most controversial issues at the convention. Several slave owners, including Martin, Mason, and James Madison of Virginia, wanted to end the slave trade. Some delegates favored outright abolition of slavery. Pinckney and Edmund Rutledge of South Carolina voiced strong objections to anti-slavery sentiment, however, and threatened to walk out of the convention if the state trade were abolished. Many Northern delegates feared that this issue might split the Union and paid close attention to the opinions of pro-slavery Southerners. Now, throughout this unit, you're going to be reading some of the biographies of several members of the Constitution. You're going to be reading the information that you're going to be given. It includes excerpts from documents during this time period. And over the course of this group project, you're going to be choosing one of the 5 issues that I mentioned earlier and reading through the different arguments and propositions made at the conventions and the compromises that were made. And then you'll have several questions to answer. You'll be in groups, probably about 6 to 8 people. And I hope you enjoy doing this project because it's really going to help enlighten and shed some light on the writing of our Constitution and its importance in American history.